You can also sit here. It's up to you. Sure. Yeah. Whatever works. Hey everyone. So we're gonna get started here just now. If you want to come grab a seat, the closer you are up front, the warmer it is. All right, welcome to the first Austin Deep Learning of 2025. Brand new year, amazing weather outside. Thank you guys for bearing through that and arriving safely here. So we have two speakers today. One of them is having some vehicular challenges, so he'll be here in a moment. But the other speaker is here. He's sitting in the front. His name's Steven. And this is Austin Deep Learning. We're gladly sponsored by Capital Factory and Antler. So if you did park in the garage downstairs, you'd probably want this validation. Shaves off like over $30. I think it's like $8 afterwards. Do you need one? Anyone else? Anyone else? Okay. I will have these with me until 8:45. After that, I will not have these on me anymore. So, and I'm very punctual. All right. So yeah, if you came here after 6 and you leave by 10 p.m., that will take effect, the validation. There is usually street parking here since it's a Tuesday after 6 p.m. for free. So we usually meet on the first Tuesdays of each month, and we focus on new developments, research. We are the oldest, longest running, and largest ML-focused group in all of Austin. And the niche that we really carve out is focusing on research and new developments. It's the 170th event since 2016. And I just want to get a quick show of hands. Who's new? Whose first time is it today? Okay, great. It's a lot more regulars. Cool. Yeah, so we're going to first have Mr. Steven here come, and he's going to talk about the changing legal landscape of AI.
Everyone, we're going to talk about the changing legal landscape. We're going to talk with a microphone. Okay, I don't need a microphone. I can yell. We're going to talk about the changing legal landscape of AI. AI is a rapidly moving topic, as everyone knows, both technologically and, as it turns out, legally. A lot of the legal landscape that is moving is very reactive as opposed to proactive. So if you ask me a clever technical question and ask if the law covers that, the answer is maybe and badly. All right, so relax. We're going to talk about roughly what's coming, and maybe it affects you, maybe not. But first, me. Hi, I'm Steve Swernofsky. Yes, I am a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV. And I'm going to talk about a wide variety of different laws, so I cribbed these all from sources that I could find. I'm an intellectual property lawyer, so I normally talk about ownership of technological ideas. So we talk about patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, that sort of thing. Most of what I'm going to talk about today does not cover that. So if you ask me a detailed question about, like, what does the EU AI Act cover, the answer is nobody else knows either. So don't worry about that. But I'll try to cover that. Also, because I'm a lawyer, I have to have a disclaimer. Everybody knows that, right? Yes, I am a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. This is not legal advice. if you have a question to ask me, make sure it's not a legal question. You know, keep all your personal secrets to yourself, because if you ask them in front of this crowd, people are going to walk off with that information.
Please do ask questions. So just raise your hand.
Yeah, definitely ask questions though, and I will try to, you know, BS my way through the answers. Okay, first of all, what is law? Law is not what you see on TV that you get from Hollywood, and it's not LA law. Law comes from a variety of sources. Okay, one is the kind of stuff that gets done in the Capitol over a few blocks from here, or in the other Capitol in Washington, D.C. One kind of law that you have to run into is regulations, where an agency somewhere says, oh, well, we are supposed to monitor, let's say, fair trade practice, and we want to see, we have an opinion as to what is or is not a fair trade practice using AI. So we want to worry about using AI, there is a law. Using AI, there is a regulation. Using AI, there might be a court case. In fact, we'll talk about at least one very big court case that's going on, which is New York Times versus OpenAI, which is still ongoing. And we also have foreign countries like to impose their own idea of law. Most notably, there is the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, okay, which we do have to worry about. Other countries are also getting into the act. For example, Japan has their own rules about what large language models and their training might or might not run into in terms of legal issues. China may or may not do that, although whether we have to respect what China's law is or Japan's law is a different issue. Some of the law that is going on is admittedly not really law, but mostly grandstanding politically. For example, the White House issued an executive order, which they called the White House AI executive order. Some of it is political grandstanding. However, some of it may affect you anyway. There is also the AI Bill of Rights, the AI Bill of Rights, which the White House issued, which is mostly an aspirational document and not really a law in the sense that you have to go off and obey it. It means people trying to score political points because they're political actors and they want people to approve of them or what they're doing, at least in this context. Oh, please do ask questions. Okay. There's also a fair amount of work that is happening in the regulatory world, where various regulators are getting into the idea of, well, we have to do things to tell people that when they use their AI systems or they design their AI systems, there's going to be something they have to deal with it. Now, regulators have a different way of looking at the world than researchers and developers. So you need to be warned. Regulators think mostly in terms of what could go wrong, not how can we make this work. So if you're a developer or you're a startup company or you're a researcher, these guys are not necessarily your friends. They are very risk averse, okay? And for some things that's great, and for some things that's not so great. And for example, if you're a developer, you may run into a part of the process which you aren't thrilled with because it gets in your way. Okay, so some key issues. One, all right? First of all, we run into an issue of what if you're using your AI and it develops something new? Okay, now I talk about intellectual property a lot, and in fact, we have run into some issues where researchers have said, oh, well, my AI thought of that. Okay, now, as of today, I think it's fair to say that no AI is smart enough to think of something or creative enough to think of something the way a human being would. But on the other hand, AI systems, and in fact the generative AI systems that are being developed these days, are actually pretty good at coming up with things that no person has seen before. So we wouldn't really say that a person thought of it, but we wouldn't really say that an actual artificial intelligence, much as we might be trying to, thought of it. This has become a legal issue. And it may stay a legal issue for a little while, probably until it becomes a really big, serious legal issue, and then there will be legislation. Another issue that has become a big issue in the AI world is the issue of training data. And now most of this is that people who produce training data are concerned with the fact that it might get used for purposes that they otherwise wouldn't be happy with. Now, I mentioned the New York Times case versus OpenAI. This is a big case. It's only one of many cases which have been filed in this field, and the courts will ultimately have to deal with that. There are also privacy issues. One of the bigger privacy issues is, well, supposing that somebody takes my personal information and they use it to go train their AI system. They have a language model and they use all the information they can find out about me, Steve Swernofsky, and they tell their language model, and the language model is then capable of spitting out all kinds of interesting conclusions about me. Whether this is a good or a bad thing depends upon who you are, and it depends upon the kind of information which is being spit out or which was taken in. Other privacy issues we'll get to, but definitely we're running into them. And an aspect of privacy is biometrics, all right? One of the classic things that has happened is that now that it's easy to collect a lot of information, some of the information that we collect is information that people never would have thought would be easily manipulable and usable, such as, for example, facial recognition, people's fingerprints, other biometric information. And then, of course, there is a concern that people have. Now, some of this may be based on fear, and some of this may be based on never seeing it before, and some of it may be based upon what I will call the black box theory of I don't like it, which is that it's very easy to get a decision out of a language model or out of a machine learning system or any kind of predictive analytics that looks like a great answer, but we don't know where that answer came from, and we don't know whether that answer was based on something that we're happy it was based on or not. All right? Yes, ask questions. Oh, are you talking about, this is the case in Canada where somebody called up and said that they called up the airline that they had gotten a ticket from, and they ended up talking to what was effectively a chatbot, and they asked for a refund, and they weren't able to get one, and the chatbot, being as biddable as it possibly could be, responded to them by saying, absolutely, we will give you a refund. And the airline later said, no, no, that wasn't us. That was our robot. And this went to court, and the court said, maybe it was your robot, but it was your robot, so pay up. And yes, that really happened. More interesting questions that happen in the automated decision world. Okay, so there we have a consumer-facing customer service bot, which is doing something which turns out to be an automated decision, and the company ends up being responsible for it. Other automated decisions that we've seen, and there has already been criticism of this in the world that predated language models but postdated machine learning and predictive analytics systems, having to do with, should we pay off on this insurance claim? Should we settle this case that we might or might not lose when it goes to court? Should this person be sentenced to jail time or not? Should this person have to post $10,000 or $50,000 in bail before he goes to trial? All right? Now, in the world of criminal defense, there's naturally a concern that something might go wrong. And also, in the world of ordinary business behavior, there is a concern that even when things go right, they might go right for the wrong reasons. Amazon, for example, found out they actually built a machine learning system, and they said, this is great. We get thousands and thousands and thousands of resumes every day, and we're just going to shove these all into an ML system, and we're going to only pop out the ones that we really ought to hire. And then they discovered that the class of people that it was popping out and saying, yes, you should hire these guys, were, let's just say, not demographically equal to the groups that they might have been interested in hiring. And there was a little bit of a stink over this because Amazon is responsible for that answer. all right? And there are actually rules that say, no, you can't consider X, Y, and Z, and no, if you do consider X, Y, and Z, you'd better not consider it, as an exclusive reason, and so on. And Amazon eventually found out that their system was popping out to hire people who are pretty much like the group of people that they already had hired, and they hadn't thought about that as a possibility. Definitely ask questions. I'm sorry? Often that kind of thing gets proved. Oh, with the chatbot, the guy had records. Yeah, he had screenshots. You could do that with it. You could do that with your checkbook too, I mean, people can make all kinds of things up. I guess I got asked once in a court proceeding, "Is that your signature?" And I said, "Well, it looks like my signature." And the guy says, "Well, is there a reason why it might not be your signature?" And I said, "Have you heard of Photoshop?" They did not like that answer. Okay, so thing one, copyright. New York Times versus OpenAI. OpenAI has a trained model. Everyone's heard of it. It's called ChatGPT, all right? They used a great deal of input text information, most notably some of it was news reports. New York Times eventually said, wait, you used our news reports and you didn't ask us. More importantly, I think New York Times said, you used our news reports and people aren't buying our papers anymore. So this case has gone to court. It has not yet finished going to court. And among other issues, New York Times asserts that OpenAI, quote, copied, unquote, their news reports. Well, OpenAI says, we didn't copy them. Our system just read them. All right? This is still open to question as to whether or not it's going to be a case or not be a case. All right? New York Times asserts that ChatGPT has a complete record of their articles. OpenAI says, oh, no, it doesn't work that way. Okay? Now, we can talk about the technology all you want, but this is a legal issue. All right? If you can copy a New York Times article, or you cannot copy a New York Times article, or if you can copy part of a New York Times article, like, let's say, the style with which it was written, or you are not legally allowed to copy a part of the New York Times article, this is a big legal issue, and it's going to make a big difference, or could make a big difference, as to the success or lack of success of language models and the kind of and other models that depend upon reading this information. There are companies that have been making serious efforts to close off the data that they have that is public-facing because they want to be paid for it. For example, Reddit did this recently, where they effectively said, if you want to use our data, you got to pay us. All right? Now, LinkedIn tried to do this a very long time ago, before there was a ChatGPT or there were large language models. LinkedIn tried to do this, and there was a big case about that, and eventually the court said, no, scraping LinkedIn is fine because it's public-facing. All right? But now the people who do have public-facing data have made an effort to say, no, it's not really public-facing unless you agree to this agreement, and the agreement says you can't use it for list, and one of those is training your large language model. So, warning, it's an issue. That's correct. New York Times says that OpenAI is infringing their copyrights. OpenAI admits that their system, that New York Times articles were used as input to its system to train their language model, but it claims that that is not a copyright infringement.
Did the New York Times have those like warnings or disclaimers on uses for training prior to the launch of ChatGPT, or was it something they did afterwards?
Okay, New York Times' argument today is that you can actually extract the full text of their articles from ChatGPT. OpenAI's response to that is, no, that only works if you deliberately hack our system. Okay, so this is an issue. And now there are some other tweaks on this. For example, there are other cases which are very similar to the New York Times case, where the the news organization or the copyright holder has attempted to say, oh, you modified our articles, you erased all the data about who the authors were, you took the titles off, you did things that you're not allowed to do, that in addition to the ordinary copyright rules that the Digital Millennium Copyright Act actually says are excluded from things you're allowed to do. And these are also being fought out in the courts. There's no real answer on these. This is really more of a big fat warning as to what could go wrong as opposed to what has yet gone wrong. But certainly, if your language model uses data from publisher X and publisher X is not happy about that, you have a potential problem. Yes?
I was wondering about, even before this, has there been some sort of traditional semantic similarity metric that is used in the court of law to gauge whether or not one body of text is too similar to another, therefore copywriting infringement?
It's up here. The test for copyright infringement is called substantial similarity. How do we tell what is substantially similar? We ask 12 people who don't know anything about the topic, is it? Okay? Not a good answer, but that's the way it is. The way it works is that copyright infringement is tested by what does a jury think? Okay, now what that typically means is you have 12 people who don't know anything about the topic, who get brought in, they're randomly selected, they don't have anything to do with either party, they get shown the materials, they get asked to make a decision. All right, now, this obviously it can become an issue if the things that they're looking at are something that average people don't see every day, or that they are things that look like what average people might see every day or might not see every day. For example, I brought a copyright case once, which was based on someone had copied my client's fabric patterns, which they then used to go make dresses. Okay, great, wonderful. Now, the standard test is again, substantial similarity. How do you tell if it's substantially similar? We ask a bunch of people who don't know anything about dresses, does this look the same to you? Okay, so the answer is, is there a similarity model? Yeah, but it's all up here. There's nowhere else. Now, what if I had to ask a dozen people, does this Python code look like that Python code? Well, that's a different question. All right, well,
One's got tabs, one's got spaces. Right?
no, what really will happen is, plaintiff's Python code will be up here, defendant's Python code will be up here, and some expert will get up on the witness stand and say, looks the same to me, and here's why. And the jury will go, well, do we believe you, or do we believe that guy? Yeah. Okay, we'll get into the issue of can AIs actually think or not think, and the answer is current systems, clearly not. All right? Obviously, this is a research issue, but will the law ever recognize it? Who knows? Yes, Eric.
I thought I heard something about OpenAI or Adobe like indemnifying use cases. What's the status of that?
The status of that is it depends very much upon companies that are trying to convince you to be a user are effectively saying, we'll protect you if you use our system. So for example, Microsoft has announced that if you use ChatGPT or if you use Microsoft Copilot, they will defend you. If you're ordinary licensed user, they'll defend you, and so you don't have to worry about the copyright infringement problems as a user. They still have to worry about those copyright problems. Now, obviously, it's in Microsoft's interest for people to think, yeah, it's safe to use Copilot. But no, those issues have not really been resolved because they won't be resolved until the question of whether or not there's any liability at all has been resolved.
To make sure I understand, you're saying that Microsoft and OpenAI are actually taking on the responsibility for saying that we will fight this in court or something along those lines?
To some extent, yes.
Has that been tested yet?
No. I mean, has it been tested in the sense that someone has come running to Microsoft and said, please protect me? The answer is probably yes. Has it been tested in the sense that Microsoft has been able to convince a court that it's not a problem? The answer is definitely no. Yes. Oh, the New York Times case? There will probably be a trial court decision within the next year, year and a half, 2 years, and then there will be, there may or may not be an appeal on that issue. And if there's an appeal, probably another couple of years, and eventually it'll percolate through the courts. Don't expect the answer tomorrow. Yeah.
So, you know, copyright with the news, is it, like, do they always have a right to the story that they cover?
No.
Or is there like a limit where, hey, there's a cutoff? You know, kind of like one Hemingway books just went into public domain. The news.
Okay, well, first of all, copyrights are a finite duration. So they don't last more than a certain period of time. But when it comes to textual material, that period of time is absurdly long compared to how long it is that people will still be interested in the text. It's also the case in the copyright world that facts are not copyrightable. So New York Times, for example, has to assert not just that you copied their material, but that you copied the parts of their material that they injected. So they can't, for example, say, we have a copyright in the report of this baseball game because there's nothing there. All right, they can have a copyright in the way they wrote the article about the baseball game, about who they mentioned first, whether it was a human interest story, whether they focused on the fact that it was raining that day or the team was not prepared or whatever, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but the fact of who won, what the score was, who played, all that's not copyrightable. And that, by the way, has been a real cause célèbre sometimes when what looked like a copyright infringement was conducted, and the defendant roughly said, we didn't take anything. Everything you're claiming that we took has been done before. I mean, has been said before, or it's a factual thing which can't be copyrighted.
So is that complicating this particular case?
It will. It will, for sure. Okay, I mean, there are even cases, for example, where two people have written similar novels, and the response that the defendant has had is, yeah, the novels are similar. They both happen to be romance novels set in a fantasy world. Okay, what did you expect? And the court has sometimes said, yeah, that's not a problem, too bad. And sometimes the court has said the opposite, like, oh, that was very cleverly done. No, and you copied it. No, can't do that. All right? J.K. Rowling was involved in a very extensive copyright case by an author who claimed that she had copied his important elements of a person attending a boarding school where they taught magic. Okay, this went to court. Now, obviously, you can have a copyright in a written work. I mean, the Harry Potter stories are very famous and well known, but can you have a copyright in absolutely everything having to do with that? No, you cannot. And does it last forever? No, it does not. Yeah, Rakshay. Thanks. Okay. Oh, I have lots more stuff, so people can ask me later if you like. I'll hang around.
You're welcome to come back and do part 2 next month, or
we could do part 2 later.
great. Okay.
Other issues that we are running into, which are interesting. Various states have created new rights by legislation. One of them is the state of Illinois, which has created a right to privacy of your biometrics. This is usually known in the privacy world as BIPA, the Biometrics Information Privacy Act, which Illinois has effectively said you can't go off and use people's fingerprints and facial recognition and related information without their approval and without telling them. For example, if I have this case correct, probably not.
Was it the Facebook one?
Pardon me? Yeah, exactly. It turns out the payoffs have turned out to be very, very large. I think There is a water park. Let's see if I remember the name of it. It's going to be terrible.
You should use it to buy the Ray-Bans. So I actually worked in face recognition in the past. So when the violation here is if you like Google someone's name and they're an Illinois resident and you just extract the biometric template from their face of a photo that's public, that is considered a violation.
That is a violation.
Yes.
And by the way, fun fact, it's $1,000 per violation for negligent violations, $5,000 for intentional violations, and there are attorney fees.
Yeah, so if you have a video system and it's doing 24 or 30 FPS, it's a lot of violations per second.
Yeah, there was a theme park that got nailed for this because they were using people's fingerprints for entry into the park if you had a season pass, and they got nailed for this, and there was an $80 million settlement. Warning, this can get real. Okay, then there's some other technical issues. For example, and a variety of agencies and some foreign governments have actually stepped into the deal and said, well, if you collect information about people using AI, or if your language model is making decisions about them because of things like employment decisions or medical decisions, whatever, you have to give them notice that you're using a system which is, let's say, a large language model or another machine learning system. There are certain rules about data retention that are being imposed. Again, these are partly due to consent, they are partly due to privacy-related issues, and so on. And there are some interesting issues which have not come up in terms of push come to shove, but you know they will come up, involving deleting people's data or correcting people's data as they are recorded in a language system. Deleting was particularly interesting since it probably is impossible to delete that information. Okay, I am eventually going to run out of time, and I'm for sure going to run out of time before I completely talk about the EU AI framework. So I will very briefly go over that the European Union has recently enacted what is called the European Union AI Act, and it divides the set of possible uses that you might have for your AI system. And by the way, they just call it an AI system. They don't tell you what they think they mean by that. And they divide it into 4 categories of risk, which they call unacceptable, high risk, limited risk, minimal risk. Okay, each one has a set of use cases associated with it. Effectively, this is the EU's attempt to legislate certain AI uses out of existence and to require others to be subject to restrictions, such as, are you using best practices? Are you getting consent? Are you assuring that a human being is testing this? And the like. All right? It's a very extensive rule, and the regulations that were issued last month are also very extensive. So, for example, unacceptable risk. I could go over this, but it's interesting what they chose to be unacceptable. So, for example, you'll see that unacceptable risk includes real-time remote biometric identification. Guess what this means? This means watching people with a camera and getting their facial recognition information. On the other hand, high risk merely includes things like critical infrastructure. So if your power plant blows up, that was just high risk. But if you kept people's social scores so that they can't buy plane tickets, that's an unacceptable risk. Let me skip over this briefly. And in the United States, we have both federal, okay, whoops, come on guys, federal and state law. All right, federal law includes, I mentioned earlier, in the political grandstanding world, there have been a couple of initiatives by the White House, one of which is an executive order to federal agencies as to how they will treat artificial intelligence and how they will treat people who use artificial intelligence systems, such as for federal contracting. There have been a number of initiatives by agencies. So, for example, the SEC is not happy if you use an AI system for your financial decisions like loan making. all right, or investing people's money, or the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, thinks that it's not a fair trade practice if you use AI systems for your employment decisions, or perhaps for deciding whether or not to grant credit to people. And of course, I talked briefly about the courts, some of the things that you run into with the courts. Also state law, I mentioned Illinois. Texas and California both have computer privacy acts, all right? Texas has recently gotten on the bandwagon of consumer privacy. And if you are a consumer and your private information is maintained by an agency that uses an AI system, you may or may not have a claim against them, depending upon how they did it and what they did. Okay, well, looks like I'm gonna get the great—
We're gonna have to do a part 2, but
the famous hook.
Yes, please give it to Stephen here.
One moment. Here we go. That's that. There's a QR code if you want to access me. I answer questions at this website. Feel free to contact me, and feel free to talk to me afterwards. I'll be here. I'll hang out and answer questions. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. All right, our next talk is over research. So this is over the Mamba paper, which came out in December 2023, so 13 months ago. And Jason Moe here has come out here a few times and wanted to give a talk on this, and we've been looking for a good speaker on this. He has a whole website about state space models. So please give it up for Jason.
All right, yeah, hello everyone. So my name is Jason Moe. I have an ongoing interest in state space models, particularly the ones that have become popular recently in deep learning. So state space models have a long history in engineering and scientific research, but Mamba is one of the special formulations of that. I'll cover a quick background on the state space model, some of the literature that led to us being able to model sequences with this form of model, and then also share some experimental results, personally testing. And we have the first question.
I don't know if this is too much to ask, that's okay, but for the movies, like, what's a state space model? Like, is there any characteristics that can help in understanding the presentation?
100%. And I will get to that exact question like in exactly 60 seconds. 100%. Good question. Okay, so probably the first question to ask if you're looking at alternative architectures is, why aren't we just using transformers? Is attention all you need? It's really the right question. Honestly, it may be correct that transformers continue getting us where we want to go. It's probably not wise to bet against them at this point. But there are some limitations to using transformers and attention. So to your point, I'll kind of discuss some of the basics here. So the main drawback with attention is it does get expensive as our input sequences grow. So if anyone's used popular models like ChatGPT in the early days, the amount of text you could put into the context window of ChatGPT was limited, and then eventually they figured out ways where you could put a lot more into the context window. And so if we take an example like War and Peace, if you just take a single page out of this book and you were to put it into a transformer model, you're really probably going to be fine. The model can process that page. Maybe you ask a question and you get an answer. If you then start feeding in the entire book into a transformer, it's going to be pretty slow. the computational power required to process these pages with the transformer is much higher than certain other models. And you may run out of memory. So there's like this dreaded CUDA out of memory error that people who train models tend to want to avoid. So let's talk about why that is. So a transformer has something called the KV cache. These are just like, just think of it as like a representation of the input sequence in a way. And the thing about the KV cache is it grows as the sequence length grows. Okay, so if we go back to this example, you know, the KV cache is somewhat small here, a little bit bigger here, and then it just kind of starts exploding when you go long sequences. So you can see these boxes are getting bigger. So that becomes a problem for memory. Our memory requirements on hardware get larger, and then it's also slower. State space models are kind of like these recurrent models. They're kind of like RNNs. They have fixed state sizes that represent the input sequence. You can see these boxes on the bottom are the same size as the sequence length grows. And yeah. Yes, this is essentially quadratic versus linear model. So the state size here is constant. So n being the state size for at least the notation of a state space model.
Is it constant or linear? Is it O of 1 or O of n?
So state space models it's a fixed state size, but the computations are linear.
Got it.
Yeah. So like, and I can bring up some of like the shapes and dimensions and stuff later. And so you get something like this. You get these training relationships for attention and SSM. So T is just the sequence length, so that how many tokens you have. N for SSM you can think of as this like state size. In the code they call it D state. It's basically an expansion factor for how large you want this like little box to be at the bottom. And then N is a slightly different thing for attention, but for the sake of the argument, just call it like the dimension of the kind of the KV vectors, KV matrices. So you can see like attention, like it has this T squared relationship for training flops. So as you add more and more tokens, your cost for training goes up. And then for inference, your inference scales linearly as you increase training size. SSM, we're sort of like going to this linear mode. So our training flops scale linearly and our inference flops per time step are constant. So that's like token per token. I'm not having to pay an increasingly higher cost in flops. N is state size here. The input is more like T. That would be tokens. Yeah. So there is the naive form of state space models does have the squared relationship here. But the main thing is you want to disconnect yourself from the sequence length. That's the key here. As I said, they can be efficient for long sequences. Did that kind of answer your question a little bit? I'm going to get to another equation. I think it'll help. So the first paper that came out in 2020 that preceded a lot of this work was not directly related to state space models. It was this paper called HIPPO, Recurrent Memory with Optimal Polynomial Projections. So there's like a lot of really complicated theoretical math in here. The gist of it is basically they realized that there wasn't a well-established theory for how to track the history of sequential data over time, like in a matrix. And if you just allow, like in a deep learning way, if you just allow like a model to try to do that by itself, it really tends to struggle. And so they realized that you can develop something called like this HIPPO matrix, which is adding sort of this structured, it's kind of these structured rules, if you want to call it that. And it basically allows you to optimally compress like a continuous history of sequence data. And you can automatically, the key is you can automatically adopt that compression to different time scales. So think about like a model, like I want a model to run for a month. And it's going to continuously run on a bunch of data. If I have to like compress history, it's going to have to adapt to like way different time scales over time if it's continuously processing data. So that's kind of like Hippo. It's kind of theoretical work. That work eventually became important for state space models. So this is kind of your question. So what is a state space model? It's kind of really simple. It's really just these two equations. You have this h of t. So this is like the hidden state. Those little boxes, if you remember that diagram before, think of that as the hidden state. So it's sort of like a memory cache of what the input sequence contains. And so what you do in a state space model is you need to evolve that hidden state over time. You can't like keep it the same. It's got to, the information that that hidden state represents has to evolve. And that's what happens here. So you have this A matrix that's multiplied by the old hidden state. And then you add this B matrix that gets multiplied by the input or the residual stream. And then you have this output equation. So the output is just this like multiplication with the C matrix to the like hidden state for the time step you want a prediction for. This will make a little bit more sense later, but basically it's just this simple. It's just these three matrices that you learn, and these things basically are able to evolve the hidden state over time. So end of 2021, we kind of get the first like state space models in deep learning literature. Like this was one of the early papers. And the main takeaway for this paper is they applied the Hippo matrix theoretical work to this type of model. And where they really concentrated the Hippo matrix was in this A matrix. So remember I said the Hippo line of work is figuring out theoretically how do we get this sort of like very efficient compressed history over lots of time scales. So that if you look at the equation, it makes sense that the A matrix is what's getting this sort of Hippo theory applied to it, because that's the matrix that's responsible for determining how the older hidden state affects the update to the new hidden state. So this A matrix is like super important. So they got it to work. It worked well for state space models on the MNIST evaluation, which is just like this time series classification task. You know, just making this kind of Hippo matrix work. They jumped from 60% to over 98% on that evaluation. So things were starting to look good for state space models with this new theoretical work. But then we kind of like realized there was a problem, and the authors didn't try to hide this. So these models are like very inefficient to train. And you would think they aren't inefficient because, as you saw like before, you remember the slide, there are a bunch of tiny boxes. So it's you know, oh, wow, it's going to be easy to train. It's not, because the RNNs have the same problem where you essentially are dedicated to having to do this sequential operation. So the hidden states for hidden state 1 depends on the hidden state before it. Hidden state 2 depends on hidden state 1. Hidden state 3 depends on hidden state 2. So then you run into this problem where you're just kind of waiting for, you know, the model to calculate these hidden states so you can calculate like a long sequence, which is what you have to do in training. So this is sort of a problem. We now have a problem. How do we solve this problem for state space models? Go ahead.
So the whole point of inventing transformer architecture was that the recurrent neural networks handle the data sequentially, and then the transformers can handle it parallelly and then give attention. So will that not affect here? Like, why would you do it sequentially and then go back to that phase where they were handling it sequentially when you can do it parallelly?
100%, absolutely. That is correct. That was the big win with transformers. It was an easily parallelizable architecture where you could, you could easily parallelize the computations needed. The reason you want to kind of revisit recurrence, I would say, is because recurrent architectures are actually very efficient, like at inference time. So if you think about those smaller boxes, if I can really intelligently figure out how to fit the right information in that small box, my throughput, like I can get a lot more tokens per second, as well as like my memory overhead for processing at inference time is way better. Go ahead. I That's the first time I've heard that connection be made, TCP ICP. That's pretty interesting. Yeah, I'd have to think about that more. That's interesting. But to your point, this is like a generalized problem, like in computer science. If you have something that requires sequential processing, how do you get around it? So to yeah, and like, so you have conventional algorithms like different types of parallel scans, right? And that's what these authors were inspired by. So to your point, they were inspired by classical solutions to these types of problems. You had a question?
How would you give attention to the sequence in RNNs?
Yeah. So it's like a fundamentally different thing. So if you were able to open up like a hidden state in these models, you would not see this sort of more easily interpretable thing that like transformers have, which are these attention scores, so these like pairwise token-to-token relationships. The state space model, like it's literally just forcing what is the most efficient map from an input sequence to an output sequence. So the interpretability of what's going on inside the hidden state, it's hard to say. It's sort of a black box in a way. Go ahead.
I guess maybe connecting those two guys, what they're saying with packets versus the, I was thinking about it, my background is atomic physics, and so
Okay.
when I look at that, I think like matrix of particles, their interactions, and so to me, I guess when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking in terms of like efficiency, and it really kind of gets at the question of like regularization. You know, can you not just have it be something, you know, grounded? I just think like the projection of a particle, like its trajectory, like as a function. So I'm just thinking like maybe you could train actual functions that go through time. As like
I think you're hitting on some good stuff that might be very similar to what you're saying.
Okay.
That's good. Good intuitions. And yeah, so you have this problem, and so then the question is, how do you solve it? The authors really begin to solve that with the first state space model that you could say was like production ready, which is called S4. It also came out at the end of 2021. And what they realized is, you know, if you look at this equation, like what's special about it? Well, the A, B, and C terms are constant. So these are constant learned matrices. And so if you have that, you can begin to kind of create this. So if you can kind of do like these bars on top of the letters, it's just the discretized forms of the matrices to deal with discrete data, but it's more or less the same. You create these hidden state equations, and then you can plug that into the output equation, and then you can kind of keep going, and you get this kind of nice formulation at the bottom where you realize this is kind of like a convolutional kernel where you can now like super efficiently calculate this in parallel. The main thing for S4, like to pull this off, they had to do some really clever things on the A matrix itself to get it to work in this convolutional form, but they basically figured it out. And you just sort of get this like, all the complexity of what you were trying to do kind of goes to this y equals k times x. It's like this convolutional kernel. It's this like really efficient filter to do parallel math, and it worked like amazingly well in S4. And what's kind of cool about the model is when you do this, you can train in the convolutional form, which is efficient for like long sequences, but like you're still going to run inference in the RNN way. So if I have like 1 million tokens at 1,000,001 tokens, I want to be in the RNN form. I want to like as I process tokens, be in those tiny boxes. So that was kind of cool. You know, like the model had both of those states. And so it was great. 30 times faster training than like the previous state-space models, like 400 times less memory, because you're not even like actually forming the hidden states when you do it this way. So it has all these like great advantages. The main problem with S4, which by the way was state-of-the-art in like a lot of audio processing, video processing, anything with like a continuous signal, it did really well. The one problem it had was when you tried to get it to model language, it didn't do well. And the authors suspected it was because like content-based reasoning was lacking because these matrices are constant. And so what Mamba introduced, which was a little over a year old, was the idea, okay, we want these parameters to be input dependent. So we want them to be able to respond to what is contained in the residual stream or the sequence. So if we go back to our equation, rather than make A, B, and C like constant learned matrices, we're going to create like these projections. So we're gonna like feed in the input X, and we can then project to a whole new A matrix, a whole new B matrix, a whole new C matrix every time step. So this is like super awesome because now the model is like way more expressive, so it can more finely decide like what goes into the input sequence, which is good for language modeling. And so this kind of idea of like you want to be selective like in this really intelligent way. So like take a page, it's sort of like attention, right? Like attention is good at knowing you want to really pay attention to this part, not so much this part, you know, and like having these token relationships. And, you know, the key thing that Mamba does is it doesn't just develop those token-to-token relationships, but it's allowed to like ignore parts of the input sequence like completely. So, you know, if you think about a text, there's probably lots of words you just don't need to like remember. You don't need to compute anything about them. They're like filler words. Probably my presentation right now has a bunch of filler words that nobody needs to remember after today. Same thing for a book, same thing for a technical report, same thing for like 1,000 emails. Go ahead.
I'm curious, my understanding is that selection is more or less the equivalent in state-space models that attention is in transformers.
100%. 100%, yes. So the key is like when you start, like you get excited about like Mamba models are selective. Like it's really exciting. But predominantly attention is also selective. So it has a selective mechanism. It's just different. And so the attention selective mechanism is like, if we want to reduce it to like these attention scores, these token-to-token attention scores. So transformers can also be selective. It becomes a little trouble. Like there are certain parts of the transformer where it can get confused with noisy data. And if you throw like a lot of irrelevant data into a transformer, it like these little bitty, like especially with the softmax, like these little bitty attention scores begin to overwhelm it, and then it can get sort of off track. A lot of newer models have somewhat fixed that, I think, with training. But Mamba sort of has this advantage where like if the tokens really are irrelevant, it's just going to ignore them completely. It's not even going to bother like, computing them. So that's part of your efficiency gain, you know, putting the right things in that small box. Go ahead.
So Mamba are the fixed matrices are then much bigger, but they're projected into smaller state space, so you can cram more information into the training model? Or?
Yes. So the matrices are much bigger. So let me think about your question here.
Limited set of information based on the input length of based in the state space, you can only have so big matrices, but when you're making a projection, you can have much more information in the trained model.
Yes, and they do that. They do use like expansion factors when they expand these matrices out. And you know, one of the things that governs how large of a projection expansion you do is like this n, so this state size. It's a good question. And so like if your state size is like small, your boxes are going to be small. If they're big, the boxes are bigger. And that's like the size of the hidden state, but it also affects the size of the A, B, and C matrices. It has that shape, those terms. Let's see. Okay, so that's great. Like we have Mamba model now. It's like it can be selective and it's input dependent, but we're back to this regime. So we've got this like problem again. The problem is we are back to not being able to train efficiently because as soon as you make A, B, and C input dependent, like at every time step, you can no longer do a convolution, and you're stuck. You know, we're stuck with sort of the sequential operation. To this gentleman's point, the kind of solution is just to do basic like parallel scans. So there's a bunch of parallel scan algorithm ideas. They implemented a particularly clever one that sort of was like this hardware aware scan where they looked at, we want to kind of do this in parallel, but then we also have problems with, when we do it in parallel, with paying like memory transfer costs. Like a really badly implemented model training pipeline like will like not account for this, and then you'll just be waiting forever for just data to transfer back and forth. So like a GPU consists of like RAM on a CPU, and then you have high bandwidth memory. In certain A100s, that'd be like 40 gigabytes, and then the SRAM, which is like the fastest you have, is only 20 megabytes, so it's not very large. So they had the idea, we're gonna like do this scan, and we're gonna perform the discretization step and do a whole bunch of stuff all at once within the SRAM, and it's gonna save us like a ton of time with memory transfers, and they're able to implement that. And at basically all sequence links, they're as good or better than the transformer if you look at the red line. If you were to just have implemented this scan in PyTorch, you can see how much worse it is, the green line above. So this hardware aware, like hardcore CUDA code is the magic of Mamba 1. And performance, so like that's what matters, right? It's not just training efficient inference. What is the performance? The main reason everyone was excited because when you ran these experiments, the loss curves for Mamba, were slightly better than transformer. You could call it almost equivalent there at the end. And then the evaluations for a lot of natural language tasks were state of the art. So it was kind of exciting. I'll keep pushing. Yeah, go ahead. Good question. So flops would be like training flops, I believe. So how much compute you're putting in. And then perplexity is like this kind of a measure of loss, but in a different form. It's kind of measuring how well the model can perform the next token. So at the same amount of flops, the Mamba model performs better than the transformer.
So lower left is best.
Lower left is what?
Best.
Lower left is best. Thank you. Yes. You want to be lower left.
What is the sequence length of 8192?
Yeah, that's the input sequence.
Is that just from the pile?
So yeah, this is language modeling. So it's like 8192 tokens, which would be maybe 6,000 words, maybe.
That's from the pile, right? That's just how
Pile.
That's how big the chunks of text are in the data set.
The Yeah, when you do like this kind of test, like you're essentially feeding in a sequence and you're seeing, can it predict the next token? So that's what this is based on. So I'll quickly try to cover Mamba 2 and then get to a couple experiments. The main problem with Mamba 1 is a problem we sometimes call the hardware lottery, which is just simply this observation that sometimes theoretical flops are not as important as actual, like, real world implementations. And so we have this thing with like the H100, which is a new GPU, has 989 teraflops of BF16 matmul, that's just matrix multiplication, versus 67 teraflops of FP32 arithmetic. Long story short, the problem is the parallel scan that Mamba 1 uses is arithmetic heavy. It's not matrix multiplication heavy. So theoretical flops look great, but time, like training and actual practice, is somewhat limiting. Especially as you increase the state size in, this problem becomes more noticeable. And so Mamba 2 comes around. So Mamba 2 came out in the middle of this year, no, middle of last year, 2024. And it basically figures out a way, it looks at the state space model equation, and it figures out if we restrict the A matrix further, and we make it like this scalar times identity, it allows us to actually do this block decomposition sort of method, where we're able to parallelize, kind of like a parallel scan, but we're able to use matrix multiplication rather than be arithmetic heavy. And that's a really good thing because we can now like do parallelized training, but take advantage of like these H100, tensor cores, which is what you want to do. So long story short, that also looked great. For some reason, this was somewhat surprising. Like the reduced expressivity, if you think about like the A matrix, if you further restrain it, technically the model is not able to make as many like precise updates to the hidden state. But in practice, it doesn't seem to hurt us, at least so far. These scaling laws are pretty good on the pile. And then this was a retrieval. It's called multi-query associative retrieval. Basically, we're able to like retrieve things just as good, if not better, than Mamba 1. And it looked really good, kind of state of the art in at least some of these categories. So I'll just kind of fast forward like a little bit, maybe, and like just explain the idea of yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a quick question on the decomposition. That's not getting just the eigenvalue, is it? Oh, the exact same thing. Yeah. Is it just the eigenvalue of A, or is it like different?
Yeah, good question. I would probably have to think about that a little bit more with you offline. It's kind of complicated how they I think you're basically pointing the right direction of what they did. Yeah. Yeah, and so if you look at like the literature, like ever since the beginning of Mamba came out, it's been really promising, but there's no free lunch. So there's like copy-intensive recall tasks. Mamba does tend to struggle a little bit. And if you can think about it, like if you have to like memorize all of War and Peace, and then somebody asks you like to like spit out every word back, that's like a pretty tall task. Transformers theoretically are capable of doing it. Mamba models, not really. Like exact token by token copy tasks, you can see the boxes are small. You're just not going to do that. It's going to be kind of this thing like fuzzy compression is what Albert Gu, the author, does. So we have different evals that we can test for retrieval capability of models, like needle in a haystack is one maybe people have heard of. In this one, it's like you just retrieve like a certain pass key as a number. It sort of allows you to create these diagrams where you can see like per context length and per depth, what's the accuracy with which you can retrieve information from a model's context length. I kind of wanted to create my own version that was a little bit more about associative reasoning, because I think these like very synthetic retrieval tasks just are not very useful at the end of the day. We don't want models to be like databases, like lookup tables. We want them to do more associative reasoning. And so that's what this is. It basically has a list of questions, and it needs to look through a bunch of relevant paragraphs and pick the relevant paragraph. This was the task. And so I created something called the copy task and the reference task. The copy task, you have to copy everything, the questions in paragraphs together, so it looks like this. It's like quite a lot of text. And the reference task is doing the same exact questions, the same exact problem, but we're going to reference the questions in paragraphs together. So sort of this matching thing. Exactly the same task. One is memory intensive, one is memory efficient. Okay. The results were pretty good. So even for the copy task, like Mamba's pretty close to the transformer baseline. This is Gemma 2B, one of the better small transformers at the time. But like as soon as you introduce like 5 threads, like 5 paragraphs it has to copy plus questions, it begins to perform much poorly than the transformer. That is not true for the reference task. The Mamba model is like basically, if you don't stress its hidden state with literal copying and memorization, it performs pretty well, as good or better than the transformer in this case. And so you're kind of in this regime. I guess just the last thing to mention as I close would be the hybrid models. If you're interested in Mamba, like definitely check out the hybrid models. This is the hybrid model. It blows everything out of the water. It was better than the transformer baseline and Mamba here. If you're interested in learning more about Mamba, like check out the papers. That's where I would start. The Mamba 2 authors also did some blog posts that are very good. And I also have a website at statespace.info where I'll update information occasionally on state-space models.
His website is legit. There's a lot of stuff on there. So please check it out. But everyone, please give a round of applause to Jason. Sure, yeah, one question's good. Yeah.
All the tests they have seen about Mamba and the selectives are with very small models compared to the two of that. Why they cannot try something 5 million, 10 million parameters?
Yes.
Because the good performance, they are very competitive against transformers that are very small. But why nothing has been done at that?
It's a good question. I think it needs to be done at the larger scale, particularly for pure Mamba models. We haven't seen, like, to your point, where's the 150 billion, 200 billion parameter Mamba models? Like, that would be an important empirical result to understand, like, does this architecture actually scale the same way a transformer does? But the hybrid models have scaled. So AI21 has done Jamba. I think they've gotten up to 400 billion parameters. Now that's like a Mamba attention hybrid. So quite a few hybrid models have scaled, and they look really good. Go ahead.
How do you deal with garbage in the states if you haven't had processed enough inputs? It would just be you have to initialize it to something or like randomize it. Like how do you deal with that influencing outputs?
Yes, so initialization of the hidden state is really important. That state space equation and those matrices are responsible for initializing the hidden state. So if you think about like that first equation, the A matrix is multiplied by the old hidden state, but if you don't have an old hidden state, it's set to 0. So that term completely goes to 0. And then you have to initialize with the term on the right.
But the model kind of has an understanding of empty state then because it's trained that way, so it kind of understands that it's empty.
Exactly. The matrices learn how to initialize the state, to your point. Yep.
How easy it is to fine-tune Mamba architecture? Because nowadays, fine-tuning a transformer is easy.
It's actually kind of super easy. So the transformers library with Hugging Face has compatibility with like the full Mamba models. So there's like some really good tutorials on it. There are not that many pre-trained Mamba models. Like 2.8b was the scale that I trained because that's what was most easily trained. The like Jamba and Zamba, these like hybrids are all transformer compatible with the Hugging Face library. So like very similar. Like I can't think of any important difference other than like your configs are going to be a little different. You have to decide on like a hidden state dimension. So you have to decide on a D state. But yeah, it's easy. Yeah, good question.
Great. So we're gonna mingle here until actually 8:50, so we have 20 minutes. After that, you don't have to leave completely. You can just exit these glass doors. Then you're no longer my liability, and security can deal with you then. So no, but seriously, you can just hang out there and keep talking. That's totally fine. There's a water cooler right there if you want to drink water. Please do not get any of the refreshments there. That's for a different event. If you haven't already, please be a member by scanning that QR code. We're at over 3,800 now. That number is outdated. Yeah, please join the group so that you can be informed of the next event. But it's pretty easy to remember. It's always the first Tuesday. And we picked that because it's free parking on the street. So you're welcome. If you did need parking validation, I'm going to ask again, does anyone need parking validation?